A reading from the Hebrew Scriptures. Every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. And because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins, as well as for those of the people. And one does not presume to take this honour, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. For the truth that comes out of suffering, thanks be to God.
Good morning. The Gospel reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 35 to 45. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Appoint us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup but I drink or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We are able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to appoint, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the turn had heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom are recognised as the rulers of the Lord is over them, and the great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. Instead, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be slaves of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life a ransom for many, for the love of God in Christ Jesus."
Well, good morning, and I must say it's a great privilege. In fact, it's a great joy to be with you this morning. A big thank you to Reverend Josephine and my good friend Elizabeth Lee, and for each of you. But my thanks actually goes not simply for inviting me to be here to reflect on the apology to the victim survivors of sexual abuse in our institutions, but a thank you for you believing that this is important, because it is. And the Royal Commission, which would have come as a great shock to many of you, as various institutions with which you had grown up as children and as adults, as parents and now as grandparents, were revealed to be flawed in a very grave way. Nevertheless, there was something that is reflected in the very first reading, and it says, "For the truth that comes out of suffering." And if ever there was an inquiry or commission in which that statement is in fact true, it is the Royal Commission. When we look back at the Royal Commission, which is now some years ago, and we reflect on the statement today, we reflect on something that is really important, not only for the institutions that were named and shamed, but for Australia collectively. And it's a story both of suffering, but of hope, of fear, and of a future which can be now different to us. When the Prime Minister, on the 22nd of October 2018, Prime Minister Morrison said, "As a nation, we confront our failure to listen, to believe, and to provide justice. To the children we failed, we say sorry." He reflected in the simplest terms the essence of what that Royal Commission over 5 years had found. But to listen, we have to listen to the voice of victim survivors. And I want to quote from a survivor that connected with the Royal Commission, Wendy Horder. And she did a private session with the Commission. And as part of her recovery, she's written a couple of books on poems. One is called Desecration. To understand this, you have to understand that as a young girl, she was abused by a minister of religion, a priest in the Catholic Church. And she's written many poems. And just one verse says this: "Who will listen to the children's pain? Who will bind their wounds? Who will nourish them again? Who will hold them in their arms and save these children of the church?" When we reflect on the Royal Commission, it's easy to talk about the numbers, but it's important to reflect on some. 8,000 people came forward in private sessions who had been sexually abused as children within institutions. Over 50 public hearings were held. Over 4,500 institutional settings were identified. They included the church in which I was a child. They included the school to which I sent my 2 sons. They included the parish in which I worship. Over 60% of all abuse was identified as having taken place in faith-based institutions, 10% in non-faith-based non-profits, and 30% in the government. So the very churches that we worship in were in fact the majority of where this abuse took place. And it isn't true, because this was a witch hunt against the church, it isn't true that this was a make-believe story blown out of all proportions. None of that was true. The truth was that the 8,000 people who came forward to us spoke the truth of what had happened. In many senses, it's also important to listen to what those who came forward in those private sessions sought. They sought 3 things. The first is they sought to be believed. And belief is a term that was very strong in the statement that was made in 2018. The second is they sought justice. Justice for themselves, but justice for the others around them who had suffered that abuse and continue to suffer that abuse today. And the third thing is that they hoped that their story, the stories that they told in private and some in public, would actually make a difference so that this abuse that took place to children in our revered institutions would never happen again. They didn't come to be called courageous. They didn't come to be thanked. They didn't come in some sense of being, this is important for me as an individual. They came because they cared about the children of the future, their children, their grandchildren, and the people in our community today. And so, as it always is the case in terms of those who have suffered most, we should listen with the greatest attentiveness possible. And I think that the Royal Commission did that. And whilst the truth is always painful, nevertheless, out of that comes something quite important. And I'll come to that in just a moment. If I can just reflect on those that did come forward, to bear this in mind when this abuse occurred, the average age of abuse was 11 years of age. Most of those that came forward were abused on multiple occasions, some by multiple people. And so this is something that takes place over time. It's not a quick incident. It's not an offence, a touch, something that is inappropriate. This is sustained and impacts children at their most vulnerable. It is true that the majority of those that abuse are men. Over 90-something% are, of course, male abusers. It's also true that women can abuse in these circumstances and did. But their stories as young people were so often the same, no matter where the abuse occurred and how it occurred. And the most important thing was that they were not believed. They were not believed by their parents. The more devout they were, the less they were believed. The more devout the family, the more connected it was to the church, the more connected it was to the clergy and the religious, the less likely their own children would be believed. There's a shocking story of a man who was in front of me in a private session, and he had told his parents, his mother particularly, that had been abused. She would not believe him. Over time, the stories of abuse grew and grew generally, even in relation to the institution, in relation to him. On her deathbed, he went to her and said, "Now will you believe me?" And she said no. She died. For that man sitting in front of me, can you say? What can you say when the person he most wanted to believe him couldn't, wouldn't, and didn't? And that's an extreme version of the lack of belief that took place. But as a society, we also failed to believe. For so many years, we'd listened to the media stories coming. And for so many years, our churches, my own, the Catholic Church in particular, dismissed these calls as an exaggeration, an attack on the church, an attack on religion. Tragically, I wish it was so, but it wasn't. And so today we have to listen to those that suffer the most in our community, because sexual abuse in the families continues unabated. The good news is that sexual abuse within our institutions, including our churches, has declined dramatically. And there's a number of reasons for that, including the work that you've done here in creating a safe church. The tragedy is in our families. There is no reduction in the level of child sexual abuse or abuse generally in the families. And that is one of the persistent social problems and shames for Australia today. Can I just reflect, if I can, on the perpetrators? I met many. I did over 300 or 400 private sessions in prisons of men. I did the men and someone else did the women who had been abused as children. Their pathway was clear, in and out of child protection, juvenile justice, prison. Some were sexual offenders. Not many, but some were sexual offenders. The point I just want to raise about this issue is that many of the perpetrators continued to be active participants within the churches. They were priests and ministers. They were sacristans and they were readers. They were members of your community and remain so today. For the vast majority, they were never held to account. They were never tapped on the shoulders. They were never reported to the police. They were never expelled from their organisations. First glance, we might say that's a shocking thing. But the second thing and the challenge that you face as church is, as an inclusive and loving church, where is their place in our churches? Where was their place in those churches? But one of the most interesting things came with the notion of mercy and forgiveness. The Salvation Army talks about mercy. The Catholic Church talks about forgiveness. I'm not quite sure what the United Church talks about, but it's in there. And one of the challenges was this. There was a public hearing around the boys' homes and girls' homes run by Salvation Army, where there was significant abuse. And one of the challenges for the commanders, the senior members, was to deal with this notion that God forgives. And of course God forgives. And if God forgives, we, the church, should forgive. And perhaps that's true. But then a young captain, a woman, she would have been in her late 20s, said yes, but even if there is forgiveness, there is also accountability. And what was happening with churches were forgiving, but not saying you are accountable. And so one of the great challenges going forward is, if we believe that God is the loving God that we believe in and is capable of forgiveness, and we as a church are capable of forgiveness, there is this notion of accountability that still remains. And many of the institutions could not understand this notion that if forgiveness was given, that was the end of the story. But there's an even greater challenge, and that is, even if God forgives, surely forgiveness must come from the victim or survivor. Surely she or he is the one that ultimately must be the person that forgives. And so how do we reconcile that? And the truth of the matter is, many of the churches, even today, struggle with this notion of a loving God who forgives, and of a church that preaches forgiveness and yet fails to hold people to account in a safe environment. Just a couple of final reflections. A reflection on myself. There were 6 commissioners. I'm the only one of the 6 commissioners that are currently actively engaged in any faith whatsoever. And every week of the 5 years, 2 questions would be put to me, particularly as a Catholic. The first was, why do you stay with that mob? Every day you hear these stories of what's gone wrong. Why do you stay? And the second is, how can you believe in some of this stuff? Let me deal with the last part. All religions have very strange things in it, some of which I believe wholeheartedly, and some of which I have less interest in at all, more so since the Royal Commission. But this first one was even harder. How can you stay with a church where day in and day out you are listening, you, Robert, are listening to this? And part of it's to find the goodness in the church. Part of it is to find that which makes us believe in a loving God and believe in a community that believes that by being a community, we can enhance our relationship with that loving God. Well, that's hard to say in the presence of so many people that were abused within those settings. But for me, it was trying to say, can the church be something different? And what struck me, 2 things were, the first was a mantra, well, it's not a mantra, it's really the statement of Micah, and that is to always act with justice, to love with tenderness, and to walk humbly with your God in faithfulness. And I found myself throughout the Royal Commission increasingly going back to that statement. Can we be a church in which we act with justice, where we love with tenderness, where we are faithful to the God that we so believe in? And the conclusion is, yes, I think we can be. And in parts we are, and in parts we always have been. But that doesn't come about by just saying those words. It comes about by practice, by the belief systems that we have ourselves. And for church that came out of the Royal Commission, the biggest statement I think we've ever heard was from the Parliamentary Inquiry in Victoria, actually, where they talked about a betrayal of trust. And the challenge for all churches, Christian and non-Christian alike, for abuse took place in all of those and many other non-church organisations, is legitimacy and integrity. Legitimacy is bestowed by others on us. We do not create legitimacy as a church or as a people. The world out there says, yes, you have a legitimacy. The old notion of church in Australia was we are legitimate, we are church, we are therefore good, we are therefore part of the community. We have a right to be respected. Not anymore. So where does this legitimacy now come from? And the second is integrity, and integrity comes from us, from within, the way in which we operate. So how have we responded to those victims and survivors in more recent times? How do we deal with those that are currently being abused, not only children, but others in domestic and family violence and so on? And this church here in Pitt Street has a reputation of being an inclusive church, a church in which the suffering can find great comfort and has for many, many times. So it is about an inclusive church, but I believe it is a church that seeks the legitimacy from the community by showing that it has changed, and integrity by being true to those things that you've read today in the readings and as you read every Sunday. So in conclusion, let me just quote again from the statement. The actual statement said, "Today we say we are sorry. Sorry that you are not sorry that you were not protected, not listened to, for refusing the truth, refusing to believe the words of children." So let me then conclude with Wendy Howarder again. Many of the people that I saw who had been abused in institutions no longer believed in faith nor in the institutions, but some did. Some had continued to remain active members of their church, despite the abuse having taken place by the church and often by senior officials in those churches. Wendy Howarder has spent the whole of her adult life seeking to reconcile with her church, the Catholic Church. In the poems I read, there is that of despair, but then there are the poems of great hope. But in the back of one of the books she wrote this: "The more we can learn from these experiences, the more we can be truly present to each other to facilitate healing. If survivors and churches work together and can learn from the past and not despair of our future, it is a time of severe testing. Yet it is the time for potential to produce great wisdom, understanding, compassion, healing, and revelation." She speaks on behalf of those that seek faith, to seek a connection to a church of some description, to seek a future not of despair, but of hope. The question, are we open to her? Are we open to them? Are we open to those who 50 years on from the abuse, 60 years on from the abuse, now seek to be part of these living, breathing, faith-based communities? For often they would say to me, I want to reconnect, but I can't find a way in. Or I tried, but they wouldn't let me in. So the challenge today is not necessarily a reflection on what happened during the Royal Commission. It's a reflection on our church today. Are we open to those that want to reconnect? Are we prepared to move from despair to hope? Are we prepared, in the words of Wendy, to find wisdom, understanding, compassion, healing, and be open to the revelation that God will give to us as we move forward? Again, thank you for believing that this statement and recognising the victims and survivors of child sexual abuse is important. Thank you.